Hi, this is Craig Rouse from the Device Integrations team at Tealium. Today we're going to implement the Tealium IQ Firebase Analytics integration for Android and iOS. The Firebase Analytics integration makes use of the remote commands feature of the Tealium mobile libraries, also known as TagBridge, which allows you to trigger native code in your app by firing a special tag in Tealium IQ. The advantage to this is that you can use Tealium IQ to configure all your Firebase Analytics events based on your existing data layer in Tealium, which reduces the burden on your mobile app developers. Another advantage is you can add new events and variables after the app has been deployed to the App Store without requiring any additional code changes, all managed through Tealium IQ. This video focuses mainly on the Tealium IQ setup, so we're assuming that you already have the Firebase Analytics remote command installed in your app. The first step is to add a new tag, and the tag type is TagBridge custom command, which contains the API code which is required to call native functions inside the Tealium SDK from within Tealium IQ. So we're going to head over to the tags tab first of all, and then add tag, and do a search in here in the marketplace for custom command. There we go, TagBridge custom command. Then we'll press add, and now you're presented with the configuration dialog. So the command ID is going to be Firebase Analytics, which is camel case. Debug mode, we can leave that switched off. That doesn't actually give us anything additional for this configuration. Next, we'll set up any load rules that we wish to set up for this tag. So it's a good idea to make sure you have some load rules switched on so that it's only going to fire when you need it to. Otherwise, you'll find that it fires on every single event that is triggered in Tealium. And then finally, the data mappings, which are all listed in the documentation. So there's a useful table in the documentation that explains what all the mappings do. But just to give you a quick example, I'm going to pick the command name variable, which in my profile is called Firebase command name. And once I've selected that, I'm going to add a custom destination, and that's going to be command_name. And press the add button and close. And there you can see we've added a custom mapping for the command name. Since I already have this configured, I'm actually going to cancel this because I don't need this configuration. And I'll show you the one that I prepared earlier on. So again, here you can see command ID Firebase Analytics. I've given it a title because by default it will just get the title of TagBridge custom command. So I've given it a meaningful title so I know what it refers to. And it has a single load rule, currently uses this Tealium event, and I've got all my mappings preset in here. So you would need to replicate these mappings as well for your implementation. Now that we've added the tag, we need to add the extensions to tell the tag which functions we wanted to trigger in the Firebase native SDK. So we'll go over to the extensions tab, and I'm just going to show you the ones that I've already set up here, and we'll run through what they all do. So first of all, before we get started, I've added a couple of static sample variables here, which represent the kinds of things that you might decide to pass in to a Tealium tracking call from your app. So we have travel class, we have order ID, and we have a loyalty status. So these are just three arbitrary bits of information that I decided I would need to use for my Firebase Analytics deployment. Second of all, we have the simple extension, which is set data values, and this simply initializes the command name. So what this command name does is it's basically a string of commands, and the native Firebase code interprets this and converts it into something that the Firebase SDK understands. So this will become clear in a moment. But here we're just setting it to a default value, which is a blank string. And this will ensure that it always has a value, so we don't get any undefined variables being passed later on. Next off, we have the Firebase config API call. And this call just sets some parameters that Firebase requires for the initialization of the Firebase SDK. So we have a session timeout, we have a minimum session length, both of these are in seconds. We have enabled, which in this case you're going to always want to set to true, because this decides whether or not Firebase Analytics is enabled or disabled. The log level, currently this only works on iOS due to some platform differences between iOS and Android. And finally, the command name, which in this case we're just initializing to config. And I've got a condition in here also which says only run this config method if the lifecycle type contains launch, because we really only want this to be run once a session. It wouldn't actually hurt to run it more than once, but it's best for efficiency's sake to just run it when it's required. Now we're going to have a look at the set user ID extension. Again, you'll see all of these extensions are using the set data values extension, which is available under the standard data tab in the extensions library. This is just for simplicity. If you wanted to, you could combine some of these into a single JavaScript code extension, or even a single set data values extension, but I've split them up to keep it nice and simple. And the nice thing about doing it this way is it makes it easy to turn things on and off at a later date if you so wish. So if you were to, for example, turn this off, nothing else is affected, but we simply wouldn't call the set user ID method. But in this case, with a demo, we do want it to be enabled. So I've given it a title, Firebase set user ID, keep it nice and simple. The scope for all of these, again, should be the scope of the tag, which is, in this case, Firebase Analytics remote command, which we configured over here. And it's important to note that anything that has the same scope in Tealium IQ has a concept of order. So the extensions will run from top to bottom as they're listed. All tags will always run first, and then after that, anything that is scoped to individual tags will run, and it will all run within the order that's listed. So the one at the bottom will run last. In order to keep things straightforward, we keep using this Firebase command name as the method of triggering the various different commands in the Firebase SDK. The reason for this is it allows you to configure multiple different commands using just a single tracking call, a single request. So this is slightly tricky, but it's easy once you've got the hang of it. So we set the field type to JavaScript code, and we take the previous value that was in Firebase command name, and then we append a string to it, which contains, first of all, a comma, and then the new value. So in this case, what we would end up with is something like config, which is what we set originally, and then a comma, and then we'd have set user ID. So what we're really doing is saying Firebase command name equals config, comma, set user ID. And we continue like this through all the extensions. So for the next one, it becomes config, set user ID, and for this one, it's set screen name. So So we gradually build up this command string until we finished with all the extensions. So just back to set user ID. So this is a very simple one. It just sets the user ID for the purposes of identifying this user and stitching together their analytics sessions in Firebase. So we know that anything that has this user ID belongs to this user. And if you wish, you could add some conditions in here just to make sure that your user ID, for example, actually has a value. So we could do is populated, which will check that, first of all, this variable is defined and that it also has a value. So it's not just an empty string, for example. Next, we're going to set the screen name, and Firebase gives you two possible variables that you can set. First of all, a screen name, which is mandatory, and then a screen class, which is optional. In this case, I've set both of them. A screen class is a high-level grouping that you may wish to use to group similar screens in your app together. So in this case, we've got an order confirmation screen, and I'm saying this is part of the order process. So we've called this the screen class order. Next, we're going to have a look at the setProperty command, which associates a particular value to the app user for the duration of their session, which is valid for all events or actions they subsequently perform. So for example, in this case, we've given the user a loyalty status, which has come through from the data layer, and we've set user loyalty status to a value of VIP. And again, the command name has been added to, and we now have set user property, which is the value that the Firebase integration is expecting. And finally, on to log event. Now, if you were to set all of these values but not have a subsequent log event, potentially none of the data would actually get sent to Firebase because there hasn't been any trigger to tell it to send any data. Now, Firebase does do some automatic events, and the automatic events would still pick up on the custom user properties and user IDs that you've set. But if the user were to quit the app before the log event had happened, then nothing would get sent. So generally, you're going to want to use log event to send your custom events to Firebase and have them appear in your reports. So again, we have command name, which ends with log event. We have an event name, which is event e-commerce purchase, which ties into the list of event names that is listed in the documentation. And finally, we have an object, a JavaScript object, which contains a set of parameters which are allowed to be passed with the event. There are some standard parameters which are listed in the documentation as well. They have a specific key name that you need to follow. So for example, param travel class is available and it maps to a constant in the Firebase SDK. And this is where we get slightly technical because I'm using a value from my data layer, which I defined earlier on. If you remember back in the sample variables, we had travel class set to first, and here I'm using the B variable and then travel underscore class, which gets the value from the data layer and puts it into this computed JavaScript code block. And we then have another variable called transaction ID. And again, this is one of the standard variables that Firebase provides. And we're passing in the order ID from our data layer, which was also defined here in the sample variables. Normally, this would come through in a tracking call that your mobile developer has already added on your order confirmation screen. So you wouldn't need to create an extension like this. This is just for demo purposes. so that we always have some sample data to play with. So now that we've configured Tealium IQ, I'm going to give you a quick run through and show you how it all works. So this is the native code that we provide in the helper class, and this provides the implementation of the Firebase SDK. So it's abstracted, and we've got a Tealium wrapper around it, and this basically allows us to interpret the commands that are coming back from Tealium IQ and then fire them to the Firebase SDK itself. So what we should see if we run this is that my configuration that I've got in Tealium IQ will trigger a command in Firebase. And then we should be able to see this coming through in the Firebase console. So I'm just running the app. And I've set some breakpoints here. So there we go. So my breakpoint has just been hit. And here we can see this is the string of commands that got returned from Tealium IQ. So as I showed you earlier on, we've got the full command string here. So for this particular event, we're going to fire all of these separate commands. And it's then going to go through this logic in here, and then further down, it will decide which functions to call on the Firebase SDK. So log event, set user property, set user ID, set screen name, or configure. So if I continue, okay, so first of all, we're going to do the configuration. Then we're going to set the user ID, which is also being provided by Tealium IQ. Then we're going to set the screen name, and again, order confirmation and order for the class. Set the property. Here we have value of VIP and property user loyalty status, and the actual event, so e-commerce purchase and the set of parameters that we passed in, transaction ID and travel class. And that's it. So if we now go and have a look in the Firebase console, I can see that I've now got 2 new events. I'm going to continue there. We can see that there's my loyalty status that's been set. Here's my screen view, and you can see that the screen name and the screen class are set. We also have some user properties down here, so user ID, loyalty status. And if we go back a bit further, we can also see the e-commerce purchase event. So this has set all of the default conversion parameters, including the transaction ID. And also the things that were already set, such as the screen class and screen name, and the user properties as well. Hopefully that's been a useful run through of the features available in the Tealium Firebase Analytics integration. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to ask a question on the learning community, where you can find documentation for all our integrations, including some brand new documentation for our Swift library, which I hope you'll find useful. Thank you.